The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a debate review of Matt Dillahunty versus Reed Johnson. Do we have good reason to believe a God exists? So for this debate review, once again, I'm not going to be going through the specifics. I think largely, if you watch the debate, and there'll be a link below, it was the last video I posted before this one, I think the debate mostly speaks for itself. I will talk about a few things that came up during the debate, but mostly there were some things about this debate that were very unusual, and I want to address those first because this was a debate in a public high school class. Now, when I say public high school class, I suspect, and I'm pretty sure, that this was actually a charter school. And I'm not a legal expert. I don't know all the rules around it, but I do know that I've worked for years to make sure that that religions don't have an undue influence in schools. And so when the teacher approached me and said, hey, I'm teaching a class on debating. We've looked at some of your past work, and originally I was going to go in and kind of just do a talk. And I was going to pick a topic that was not at all about religion, as an example, to talk about what my thought processes are when I'm getting ready to do a debate, how I go about planning, what I think of the differences between debating for points versus debating to actually convince or to make a compelling case for it, some of which I'll be talking about in this video in a little bit. But the teacher came up with an alternate option, which was to bring in a preacher and have us do a debate. Originally, I had suggested that we talk about something like morality, where people could get a different view, a different perspective on things without it necessarily being about religion, or that we could debate some fundamental aspect of science where there might be a conflict between, let's say, evolution and creationism. I was told that he really wanted to debate something more along the lines of, hey, do we have reason to believe that God exists? And I replied that, okay, I'd be fine with that, but I wanted to make sure the topic was, do we have good reasons to believe that a God exists? Because if you don't include the word good, the topic becomes irrelevant. Of course, you can come up with reasons, bad reasons, to believe anything. And I actually addressed this a little bit during the debate. But we were focused initially on making sure, and this is why it's mentioned at the outset of the debate, that there was no perception that we were there to essentially proselytize. This is an incredibly difficult thing to do. I'm coming in to defend the position that we don't have good reasons to believe that a God exists. Reed is coming in to defend the proposition that we do have good reasons to believe that a God exists. And it's very difficult to make the claim that, we're not here to proselytize. Well, you always kind of are. You are defending your position. The reason that I was fairly comfortable with it was that this was set up to be fair. There's no requirement on him to defend tenets of his particular religion. The subject was whether or not we have good reason to believe something. So he has a strong positive. I have a strong negative. This is different if we were to debate something like, does God exist? Because his answer would be yes. And my answer would be, I have no idea. I have no reason to believe that a God exists. I don't think that's the case. But so when you frame the question as, do we have good reason to believe God exists? Now you fundamentally change this, where he's defending a strong yes, I'm defending a strong no. We get to make our presentations about how and why we make the determination that we have sufficient justification for belief. And we don't have to defend specific religious tenets. We don't have to get into a battle over, did Jesus rise from the dead? Is Jesus the one true way? I will say that Reed did a bit more preaching and a bit more kind of mild proselytizing for his particular God belief. That's not to be unexpected, and I think that there's an opportunity, if both of us are there to speak, to make sure that this is not unfair proselytizing, that we are in fact focused on the debating. And so on that front, I want to talk a little bit about what my strategy was going into this debate and why. So as I've discussed a few times in the past, my position that I tend to defend in debates is not the hard atheist or strong atheist position, the assertion that there is no God or that there's probably no God. I do hold that position depending on, definitions of knowledge. I might even claim to know that there's no God, but as I pointed out before, I find that to be an unnecessary shifting of the burden of proof, because everything that I talk about is to push forward the idea of sound skepticism, humanism, and to put forward unassailable positions. Things that, rather than trying to claim too much too broadly, you can just say, look, the side that claims that a God exists or that miracles happen or that Jesus rose from the dead or whatever the subject is, has not made their case. They haven't demonstrated sufficient reason to believe this. And it frustrates opponents to the point where you didn't come in and defend the idea that there's no God. Yes, you're correct. I did not come in and set up a false dichotomy. I did not come in and set up a scenario under which if I fail to prove that there isn't a God, you win by default. That's preposterous, because the proposition that a God exists or that Jesus rose from the dead, etc., all of those things need evidence and argument to support that position. And until such time as that claim has met its burden of proof, disbelief of that claim is the justified starting point. What I wanted to do coming into this particular debate is I knew I had a bunch of high school students who were in a class about debate. I did one semester of debate class I've talked about in the past. There's no reason to really rehash it today. There's a couple of funny stories related to it, but I don't remember much from it, and I don't remember enjoying it much. And as I've done more and more debates as an adult, I'm finding that my opponents fit into a few different categories. And the more debates I do, the much easier it is to categorize who I'm actually up against, and I can do it fairly quickly. Having spent 13 and a half years on the TV show, I can spot where people are going quite frequently within the first sentence or two of what they have to say on the subject. But you can't teach that. That is something a skill that you develop and hone over time. You learn through experience. So what I wanted to do was to be prepared to talk about debate in the abstract during a Q&A session. I wanted to point out that the topic of the debate, which was written incorrectly on the board, it was supposed to be, do we have good reasons to believe God exists? And instead it was just written, do we have reasons to believe God exists? So I knew I needed to address that first. And as you've seen in some of the other debates, the primary focus of this was, what do we mean when we say that we have good reasons to believe something? What sort of epistemological foundations exist such that we can be justified in accepting a proposition is true or likely true? But you can't put it in language like that to average high school students. There's a good chance that many of them will understand it, but they may know and understand some of these things far better than I do or the other adults in the room do. But I want to make sure that I'm putting forth my positions in a way that is approachable and understandable to anyone. So I spent a little bit of time preparing the opening statement so that it was fairly simple and fairly clear. Now, to be fair, I was actually sick this day, which is why I sound weird and why I'm a little sluggish, and as someone pointed out, why my facial expressions were a bit more animated than you might normally see in a debate. When we do the full debate review, I will definitely point that out. I don't know if it's a mistake on my part, but when I set out to go into this classroom, the goals were, make sure you're not proselytizing for a position, that you are defending a position within the scope of debate. Number two, make sure that you teach something that has nothing to do with debate, which isn't objectionable, which is skepticism. Not necessarily humanism, but skepticism, applying critical thinking, coming up with good reasons to believe. Make sure that when your opponent is presenting their case, that you are actually addressing their case, that you're not going off down a rabbit hole or addressing some, oblique concern Or normally people would argue this way, I don't know what the hell's wrong with my opponent. This was just the weirdest stuff ever. That was my thoughts right up until the point where the debate started. And then I became aware, I knew that caution was required. But as soon as he started talking, there were a couple things that happened that made me realize fairly early where we were going to be going in this debate. He started off by pointing out, oh, this is his first debate, so take it easy on him. It's the humorous kind of, I'm not this slick debater like my opponent. I'm just kind of here to tell you why I'm convinced. And while I originally thought that might have been, like a ploy, because another number of people doing it. I can't count the number of debates I've done where it was somebody's first debate or seen where it was somebody's first debate, and they make this at the outset. Yes, you could object that they are poisoning the well, that they are trying to bring in something that's irrelevant, to garner some sympathy, let's take it easy on it. In reality, we know it's a debate, and it's supposed to be an interaction about ideas. So there's no reason to take it easy on someone's ideas at all. Despite this, I sort of did take it a little bit easy, because you have to, first of all, read the faces of your audience. You guys can't see the faces of these high schoolers, but I could. And I could tell which people in the room were immediately put off by certain things he said, and which people in the room were immediately put off by things I said. And this is the process. I have multiple audiences anytime there's a debate like this. First of all, there's the person that I'm engaging with. Second, there's the actual audience sitting there that I'm going to get some feedback from, even if they're supposed to sit quietly and say nothing. Then there's the broader audience of this thing's going to be posted online. And you have to consider all of those audiences and walk this, path to try to do the best you can for all the audiences, or at least pick one that you really, really want to focus on if you can't do that. He, on the other hand, was preaching far more than debating. And I don't want to get into too many of the specifics of his arguments, but there are a couple things I wanted to touch on. And I also wanted to explain why one of them had to be stated out loud twice before I objected. So as I said, we're not going to go through every single argument, but there were a couple of things that happened that stick in my mind very clearly, even though I haven't gone back and watched this debate again, other than portions of it while editing real quickly. One of the first things that struck me is the type of arguments that he decided to present fit into a very specific category. And when I said earlier that I have seen so much of this that I'm starting to create little labels for the type of debate opponent that I have. For example, there's someone like John Ferrer, who I've debated a couple times, who's far more scholarly and interested in the philosophical aspects. Then there's someone like Blake Junta, who I put into a similar but different category from John, in that Blake and I can have much better conversations than John and I actually can. Then there are, so you've got a variety of areas of kind of sort of sophisticated theologians or expert apologists or people who've spent a great deal of time studying. And then you have the other group who are primarily preachers, but they're still interested in defending their faith. And they don't have a solid grounding in logical fallacies, in constructing arguments, in evaluating evidence with respect to reason. And curiously, there's overlap. For example, the resurrection debate that I did with Mike Licona, we've already talked about. He presented all of this, garbage cans moving and Ouija boards and all this other stuff in order to kind of poison the well that reality, there's a good reason to think that reality has a supernatural component. He's kind of like the bridge, because he certainly studied things like the resurrection, and he kind of seems to have a good understanding of fallacies. And then there are just the straight up preachers. One of these days I'll put together a chart. In the past I divided them and talked about the difference between evangelists and apologists. But in this case, Reed, who's a really good guy, and we're probably going to go hang out. He's local here in Austin. We have some similar interests, and we both have an interest in speaking some more. But when it comes to arguments presented, it was, hey, I just, I see this stuff. We prayed, and we've seen the results of prayer, and we've seen these other things, and we've seen money show up. And it reminded me a little bit of Lacona, hey, we prayed, and this group really needed this money, and they got the exact amount. It's always the exact amount, and never is there any indication that there's actual evidence for this. And we know how people exaggerate. We know you're getting information secondhand. We know that stuff like this happens quite frequently. And the two moments that stuck out, the first one I hit on right off the bat, which was he stated, this couldn't be coincidence. And then he kind of backtracked and said, well, it could be, but it seems unlikely that it's coincidence. And I addressed that during the debate, and I think I did okay. There's probably a lot more that could be said on that topic, and maybe we'll cover that another time. But there was one that the first time he said it, I think is probably one of the first instances where you see like a stink face on me, a reaction. I couldn't do it, but you can see it in there. That's when he talked about evolution as if you can't bang sticks and rocks together and get a bird, or whatever his example was, but this idea of banging sticks and rocks together. And the first time he said it, there were a bunch of other things that I had to address. And it gets me to one important takeaway. For those of you who aren't doing formal debates, as you know, just interrupt. Make sure it's clear at the outset that you're not interrupting to be rude. You're not interrupting to shut down. You are trying to get clarification. You want to make sure that you heard what you thought you heard, that you want to get definitions. You want to be able to mirror back to them. If they say something, and you should say something along the lines of, okay, what I hear you saying, or what my understanding of what you just said is this. And if they say anything other than yes, keep doing that until you get a yes, because you don't want to be arguing against a straw man representation of their views. In this case, it was almost shocking to hear someone just dismissive of basic science facts that they clearly don't understand, that they have a gross conceptual error about. I don't use that phrase as often as I used to, but I love it. When I was in the Navy, when I was in nuclear power school, you would take tests, and the instructors would, hey, you got this one right, you got this one wrong, and sometimes they would just write GCE, because that stands for gross conceptual error. And what it essentially means is your answer is so wrong that you clearly have no clue what the hell we're talking about, and we need to pull back, set aside, and get these basic foundational concepts into your head correctly, because you're not going to be able to go to the next thing. That's the last thing you wanted to see on paper, was GCE. If I saw GCE on the paper, it was, you could have gotten everything else right, but that GCE was, holy crap, I'm a miserable failure. I thought I understood something and I got it completely wrong. The nice thing was that once you got over the ego problem of getting a GCE and actually dug in on it, what you'd often find is that the honest mind who's seeking to understand can usually get over those gross conceptual errors pretty quickly. It may be that you misheard something. It may be that there was some foundational understanding that sent you off down that really awful path. And so the first time he said this about evolution, I think I just made a face, but I didn't address it. When you're in a formal debate, you're trying to take notes and you want to find the things that really need to be addressed. But you also need to make sure that you're being strategic about it. If your opponent says 20 things that are wrong, you have to pick out which ones you actually have time to address and which ones will have the biggest impact. But you can also, what I do when I'm taking notes is I will write down kind of abbreviated versions of what my opponent said, and then I'll put marks next to them to kind of rank them on the fly so I know what I need to address. But there are also things that I will just circle, because if I don't get to that particular point of rebuttal, I know I want to come back to it in a future rebuttal, in a future question period, or in a closing, or if someone during the Q&A period asks about it, I have an answer that I've kind of worked up. So the first time he talked about banging sticks and rocks together, I knew immediately what needed to be said, but I didn't say it. And this brings us to the second time that he said this, where I flatly interrupted, despite the fact that it wasn't my time. This, in a structured 4 points debate, would have lost me points. But in reality, in a debate where you're actually concerned about convincing people, it can, in fact, win you much favor. What we had here was one person who not only didn't know and understand the science, who had a gross conceptual error about the science, but presented it in such a way that it was a cartoonish straw man, which is why the second time it came up, I interrupted to say that, I don't remember the exact wording they had, but essentially it was, that is a ridiculous straw man. No scientist on the planet has ever presented evolution as if you bang sticks and rocks together and you get an animal. And when you portray the science that you're denigrating in such a way, what you're essentially doing would be as if I sat down there and said, hey, look, Reed believes there's a bearded man in the sky, and that's just ridiculous. Well, that's not what Reed believes. It would be an unfair straw man. It's one of the reasons why I don't often, like those sorts of memes and that sort of discussion. Oh, you believe there's a bearded man in the sky. No, there's a bit more to it than that. But here's the curious thing. If I were to say that Reed believes in a bearded man in the sky, even as unfair and inaccurate as that is, it would still be leaps and bounds more accurate than his representation of evolution being the result of sticks and stones being banged together. Because Reed does believe in a God. Whether or not he has a beard is kind of irrelevant. And if he believes that God's everywhere, then God would also be in the sky. So at least there's some way to twist that to where I am vaguely representing what he believes. Although it's not the sort of claim I would ever make, because I understand that it's not an accurate representation of Christianity, of God beliefs. It's oversimplified and it's ridiculous. When you say evolution is, or imply that evolution is about sticks and stones banging together and producing, a dog or whatever the example was, anyone who has any basic understanding of science knows that you do not. And the first time he said it, I knew I was going to get back to it, even if he didn't say it again. But I also read the audience. And the kids that were there clearly had a sufficient understanding of science that they knew that this was just a snarky, inaccurate, dismissive comment. The second time he said it, though, I wanted to make sure that I got that in. And that brings me to the last 2 points. In the past, I've talked about how I don't really like debate classes or collegiate-style debates where you're debating for points and you have rules. I've backtracked on that a little bit, and I want to explain this in a nutshell. I like the fact that we teach people how to have debates, even if, in my view, we're teaching them how to do it wrong. The idea of rules and structure is there to show that we need to have some order in these discussions so that it doesn't become a bully festival, that somebody just can't monopolize all the time, walk all over someone. We need to have a good understanding of the process so that we can get to the sort of debates that aren't scored. I don't like some of the aspects of scoring because it turns people's views of debate into winning and losing. And this context of winning and losing is specifically centered around, oh, this person is a better debater, or that person is a better or worse debater. And I don't view debates in that way. My view of debates is these arguments were better. This individual made a more compelling case, not I liked this person better. They didn't interrupt. You know, oh, I'm going to mark you down for interrupting, and you interrupted 2 or 3 times. When you're really trying to get ideas across, when you see someone maintaining composure and playing by the rules through an entire debate, and you reach a point where it seems that they just can't help but interrupt, which is actually what happened. It's not like I said, you know, next time he brings this up, I'm going to interrupt him for a strategic point. It's just something that naturally happens. You get to a limit and you have to interrupt. I think that can be beneficial because as long as what you're doing is fairly calling out a ridiculously dishonest argument, which is exactly what was happening there. The last notes on this kind of free-form debate review are that the subject was, do we have good reason to believe that a God exists? I think from the standpoint of the issue, I gave a fairly decent, for a sick guy, take on skepticism and what sort of evidence might be required. And I offered sound objections, I won't necessarily say rebuttals, to the points that he was making. Called out the problems in his position that came from himself. When you say that, oh, this couldn't be coincidence, but then you point out that, yeah, well, it could be coincidence. It just seems unlikely. Or that unlikely coincidences somehow make it justified to believe that there's a God behind it. Why not, you know, why wouldn't this just be just as good of a justification for believing in, you know, a directed form of karma, as if the universe was somehow conscious and not, you know, it's looking for justice. At the end of the debate, the issue of do we have good reason to believe that God exists, Reed presented the reasons that he thought were good, and I pointed out why I think that every reason that he gave is not just bad, but ridiculously bad. His straw man, sticks and stones thing on evolution was ridiculously bad and demonstrated a gross conceptual error about the actual science. And it may in fact demonstrate a bias against the science, that he has in fact begun with this belief, and this colors his perception of the science. His presentation of things that many of us would view as coincidental, answered prayers and healing and things that he views as miraculous. The foundational problem here is that even if he were to accurately demonstrate something that you might reasonably conclude was miraculous, which isn't what happened, he's still doing the same thing that Mike Licona did. And that is, we don't know how, we don't have an explanation for this, but it's consistent with my belief in God. Therefore, I'm going to attribute it to a God. I'm going to label it as supernatural, take the unknown, unexplained, label it as supernatural, so that I can pretend that I have an explanation for the unexplained, in that God did it. That is why the next video that we're going to do is about something that I'm hearing actually more often. I heard it quite a while ago. It sort of went away. It's absolutely preposterous. And yet I'm starting to hear it more and seeing it in some different forms in debate opponents. And that is the idea that you first need to believe, and then the evidence will follow. And we'll address that on the next time. Thanks for watching. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.